Hello, and welcome to the third installment in the Christian History mini lecture series. Today, we're going to be taking a detour. We're doing something a little bit different. Instead of studying an era of Christian history, we are going to basically do a crash course on Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy, after which we are going to reflect just a little bit on the extent to which Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy are compatible with Christianity. Now, the reason we are doing this, Plato and Aristotle are not Christians, so you might be wondering, why are we studying them within this course? And the answer is simply this. Plato and Aristotle are two philosophers that have left tremendous marks on Western philosophy, on Western thinking, and also on Christian theology and the story of the church, because over the centuries, Christians have adopted elements of Platonism and Aristotelianism into their own way of thinking, into the way that they came to approach the Word of God. And this is going to cause controversy. Over the course of the centuries, Christians will disagree on the extent to which we ought to incorporate Platonism and Aristotelianism into the way that we come to understand God and this world. So my hope is that this lesson will provide you guys with the tools necessary to better understand some of the controversies that are coming up down the road. Now, we have three objectives for today. Firstly, you'll be able to explain Plato's and Aristotle's respective contributions to the history of ideas. Secondly, you'll be able to explain some of the major differences between Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy. And finally, you'll be able to anticipate problems that might arise when Platonism and Aristotelianism are synthesized with Christianity. Now, we can't talk about Plato and Aristotle without talking first about Socrates, and there is much to say about him, not enough time. But Socrates was basically the inventor and popularizer of the dialectic. When I say the dialectic, I mean the art of philosophical discourse and dialogue in order to arrive at the truth. And if you've ever read any of Plato's dialogues, Socrates is often the main character, and Socrates will speak and will engage in discussion with various people in order to kind of lead them and arrive at the truth. Now, there are four dialogues that I'd like to speak about that Plato wrote. Now, it's important to note that Socrates himself did not write anything. He did not write any philosophical treatises, did not leave any writing behind for us. What we know of Socrates and all the words of Socrates that we possess were written down by his student Plato, who most likely took liberties to expand the ideas that Socrates communicated, and Socrates becomes kind of this romanticized figure in a lot of Plato's dialogues. Now, in the dialogue Euthyphro, Socrates is waiting outside of basically the courthouse, waiting to be tried because he is being accused of a number of things, when Socrates meets a member of society named Euthyphro, who is prosecuting his own father. And Euthyphro is someone who is really confident that he knows the difference between right and wrong. He's a very self-righteous fellow. But Socrates engages in a dialogue with Euthyphro and realizes very quickly that Euthyphro does not know what he's talking about. And not just Euthyphro, but the society that Euthyphro represents is a society that does not possess a cogent system for understanding the difference between right and wrong. In the Apology, Socrates is basically giving a defense. He is in court. He is being accused of atheism, of impiety. He is accused of denying the gods. He's accused of corrupting the youth. And these are, Plato wants us to believe, are false charges. And Socrates dismantles these charges, dismantles his opponent's argument, but in so doing, basically gets the jury offended. He offends them, they turn against him, and they sentence him to death. Now, Socrates, in the next two dialogues, Crito and Phaedo, Socrates is awaiting execution in prison. And in the dialogue Crito, Socrates refuses to escape execution for the sake of Athens. He says, even though I am being unjustly executed, I should accept my execution rather than break the law and break the system and encourage other people to likewise break the law. The common good is more important than my life. And in the dialogue Phaedo, Socrates is spending his last moments with his friends and students, and he reflects a little bit on the afterlife. Socrates believes that souls are not annihilated when a human dies, but rather the soul is is removed from its body, and that there is an afterlife in which the virtuous souls receive blessing and reward, and those souls that are vicious, the souls that are deeply ensnared by physical pleasure, those souls are the ones that will basically face punishment and consequences. So Socrates submits to his execution, drinks poison, and then tells one of his friends, Crito, to offer a sacrifice to Asclepius, the god of healing, indicating that he believes that his death, which will liberate his soul from his body, is actually a cure and not a disease. Now, Socrates' student Plato builds on Socrates' legacy and translates that legacy to us. And Plato, perhaps more than any philosopher ever, revolutionizes Western thought. He exposes the inadequacy of traditional and mythological worldviews. He focuses very deeply on objective truth, goodness, and beauty. Some people have asserted that Plato's mission was to present to the world a strong case for the fact that there is an objective truth. Plato is the first to identify the four cardinal virtues: temperance, fortitude, justice, and prudence. And these cardinal virtues are going to be embraced not only by future philosophers, but by Christians. And we're going to incorporate this within what we come to understand as the seven virtues. And we'll speak more about that later. Plato turned the focus of the West on the spiritual, right? Plato is not the first spiritualist who ever lived, but his emphasis on the fact the physical world, not only is it not all that there is, but that it is a lesser copy of a greater spiritual reality, is going to have a huge impact on the way that people think and the way that they live. Plato established an academy, a school for philosophical thinking, and he's also the father of Western utopianism, as people over the centuries have tried to, inspired by his Republic, create an ideal society in which people are encouraged to live virtuously and not viciously. Now, Plato's philosophy is often framed in the terms of his most famous allegory, the allegory of the cave. In Book 7 of Plato's Republic, Plato has Socrates tell some fellow philosophers a story. He says, imagine a cave, and imagine that in this cave there are a number of prisoners who are chained to this cave, and they have never left the cave. They have always lived in this cave. Now imagine that these men are chained and they are facing a wall, and behind them is a fire that is casting light onto the wall, and that men are taking objects and placing them in front of the fire behind the men, so that shadows are cast in front of the men on the walls of the cave, and that those shadows are the only things these men have ever seen. Would not these men think that those shadows were actually real things, and that those shadows are all that there are? Now, imagine that you had a prisoner freed. You freed a prisoner and had him somehow come out to the surface world. He might not know how to process the fact that not only are those shadows not the real thing, but there's an entire realm of things that are more real than those shadows. But let's say that he adjusts to it, his mind adjusts to this new reality, a new truth, and he's filled with great joy over the fact that he can encounter a truer reality. He might come back down to the men and try to talk to them about this greater reality, but they might not believe him. They might tell him, no, these shadows are all that there are. And maybe this man will try to free his fellow prisoners and bring them up to the surface by force, but Socrates says, well, they would kill him before they let him do that, because they are so comfortable in their ignorance and the truth is scary. Now, Socrates is using this as an allegory for true education, but it can be framed as an allegory of Socrates' view of the world, right? Imagine the shadows on the wall as being physical reality. But what if there was a reality even deeper and more real than the physical world that we live in? What if physical objects and what I see with my eyes, what if that itself is a shadowy, lesser copy of a deeper, greater reality? Plato refers to that higher reality as the realm of the forms, that everything that there is, it's essence is derived from a form that is unchanging. For an example, a chair, right? A chair itself, we have very different types of chairs, but because of the fact that there is some understanding that all of those chairs that look differently share some quality that we might refer to as chairness, there must be a form of a chair, something that is kind of the ideal picture, or not just picture, but the ideal reality from which all these contingent realities are based. Now, Plato, elsewhere in the Republic, presents to us a number of very interesting ideas. In Plato's Republic, he rejects consequentialism, the idea that the ends justify the means, the idea that justice also is just a compromise between people who all want their own way. Plato defends the idea of objective justice. And in order to illustrate the meaning of justice, he says, imagine that there was this ideal city, right? That is really kind of a, inflated or kind of a portrayal of the human soul kind of writ large. And in an ideal city, imagine that we divided the city into three classes associated with different parts of the soul. Plato believed that there were three parts of the soul: the appetitive, right, down low, right, which is associated with our appetites. It's the most animalistic part of our soul. The spirited, which is concerned more with honor and glory and justice. And the rational, right, prudence. And imagine a society in which we had laborers at the bottom, right, who were producing for the society. We had a realm, or not a realm, but a group of auxiliaries, warriors above them, right, who honorably defended the society. And then we had a class of citizens called the guardians, or the philosopher kings, who were fluent in philosophy, who pursued the form of the good and the form of beauty, and who ruled justly and wisely over the rest of the society. Would we not have a city that was harmonious, that was beautiful, in which virtue thrived? Now, it's important to note that Plato wasn't trying to assert that this could be accomplished in real life, but that this was maybe an ideal that we could kind of strive toward. Plato's Republic ends with some reflection on the afterlife, and Plato has his character Socrates surmise that eternal souls receive a lot in the afterlife which they have merited based on the way that they have lived in this life, based on whether or not they've pursued virtue. Now, Plato, a little bit less famous work, but also super influential, is his Timaeus. And Timaeus is a very interesting dialogue. It really contains his theory of creation. In Plato's Timaeus, Plato asserts that there are basically two realms. The physical world, the world that we see here, it's changing. It's a realm of decay. It's a realm of opinion and chaos where things are not certain. But there's also a spiritual world, a deeper world that is unchanging, a realm of reason and order and number. Plato was a huge fan of Pythagoras, so he gets a lot of these ideas from Pythagoras. And Plato asserts that the physical world is not worthless, but is, as we've mentioned before, a lesser copy of something deeper and something glorious and beautiful and orderly and rational. Plato asserts that there is a demiurge, or a god, a craftsman god, who creates the world from the five geometric solids. So from these perfect geometric shapes, God created the universe, bringing order to disorder, because that is the type of God that he is. He is good. God fashions the world within a spherical structure, and he fits the human soul, including our reason, our emotions, and appetite, into the human body. And in Plato's Timaeus, right, he is demonstrating, he's asserting that this world, right, while it seems to be full of decay and it is full of brokenness, and the physical world is not all that there is, that even this physical world is an emanation from, it's a representation, it's been created out of a deeper rational order, and there's hope for us to arrive at knowledge of a deeper truth. Now, Plato's student, Aristotle, differed from Plato in many, many, many different ways. Aristotle was a student of Plato's academy. He famously rejected Plato's theory of the forms. He didn't like it. Aristotle is famous for a number of accomplishments, among which he revolutionized natural philosophy and science. Okay, this includes his study of physics, metaphysics, biology, astronomy. He set forth rules and principles of logic and rhetoric. If you have learned syllogisms, right, and formal logic in school, you can thank Aristotle. He's the one who set forth the rules for us. Aristotle provided a framework for understanding literary genre and much, much more. Now, Aristotle's virtue ethics is best represented, I think, by his book Nicomachean Ethics, and it's reflected in also his Politics. In Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he asserts that everything aims toward a good, right? Every endeavor aims towards a good, even if not everyone achieves it, which means that there is an ultimate end. The ultimate end of all things is something we'll refer to as the supreme good. However, there's diversity, right? I mean, even if an acorn aspires to be towards the good and I aspire towards the good, it doesn't mean that the acorn and I are going to look the same, in 20 years. Everyone has an individual telos, right? That we are oriented towards the good in a unique way. And that if we pursue that telos, right, that's what virtue is. Virtue refers to a kind of habit forming where I am becoming better and better. I am basically becoming what I was meant to be, right? And in Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle asserts that between two vices, you can imagine there being a virtue. And let me explain that a little bit better. Let's say the virtue of courage, right? You might have someone who is overly rash and reckless and brash, right? And that's excessive. That's an excessive vice. But let's say that there was someone that was wimpy and cowardly. That person is deficient in courage. And you see that courage is sort of the midpoint between brashness and cowardice and passivity. Courage is the golden mean. Now, in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he champions something that he'll refer to as the perfect friendship, true friendship. And Aristotle asserts that there are basically three different kinds of friendships. Friendships of pleasure, right, where you're just with each other for the sake of pleasure. Friendships of utility, where you're using friendships in order to advance yourself. And finally, friendships that are true. And a true friendship is a friendship in which you are treating the friend as an end and not a means, and in which you pursue virtue together. And Aristotle's view of friendship is very interesting because in Plato's Republic, Plato did not like the idea of individual friendships. He believed that the guardians should not have families. They should not own private property. Everything should be shared. Even the wives should be shared. Get rid of individual family, because individual family, right, will promote a kind of selfishness and caring for myself over others. But notice that Aristotle sees value in individual friendships and individual relationships. And as a matter of fact, Aristotle's ideal city, his polis, is a virtuous city, a place where virtuous friendships abound. So imagine a city in which a number of diverse individuals are developing friendships with each other and encouraging each other to pursue virtue. That is Aristotle's view of politics, his view of what we ought to strive for politically. Now, Aristotle's virtue ethics, his political philosophy, can be traced back to his natural philosophy. We talked about the concept of telos, but I want to talk a little bit about Aristotle's view of forms. So Plato asserted that forms are changeless, whereas things that are physical, right, that they are kind of lesser copies of these forms. They change, they decay, and Plato believed that the forms can exist apart from matter. Aristotle did not believe that. Aristotle did not believe that form can exist apart from matter. You can't take, let me give you this example. This is my Apple Pencil. I can't take the matter of this Apple Pencil, put it on one side, and take the form, its shape, and put it on the other side. No, we don't have, there's no such thing as shapeless matter. Likewise, Aristotle says everything, right, that has matter, every bit of material has some sort of form. They're inextricable. And as a matter of fact, Aristotle asserts that the human soul is the form of the body, which means that the human soul cannot exist apart from the body. So while Plato believed that even after our bodies are destroyed, our souls live on, Aristotle did not believe that. He thought that if the body were destroyed, the soul would be gone too. Now, Aristotle asserted that everything has a nature that is bent towards its telos. Everything has a nature that tends toward a certain direction, right? So think of the acorn in the image here. The acorn, its telos is to become an oak tree, right? It is what it wants to become. Now, you could do terrible things to the acorn, you could smash it and make sure it doesn't become the oak tree, and that's unhealthy, right? But if it flourishes, right, it will become what it was meant to be. And this relates to his idea of physics. I mean, imagine that this was a rock and I were to drop a rock. Why do rocks move downwards? It's because the telos of the rock is downwards. Why do flames move upwards? It's because the telos of the flame moves upwards. He's coming up with a law for understanding movement, for understanding change. Aristotle also believed that the material universe is eternal. He did not think that this physical universe had a beginning like Plato did. And because it's eternal, you get a sense that Aristotle's trying to hype up the importance of the thing. Now, Aristotle did believe in God, but he believed that this God was one who was eternally moving all things, and the one thing that is not moved, that there is an unmoved mover who is the cause of all things. However, Aristotle did not believe that this unmoved mover, because he's unmoved, he did not think that he was aware of our existence or that he actually cared about us, but that all things that move, all science, everything that is, can be explained as a cause of this unmoved mover. Now, Aristotle is also a scientist, and Aristotle believed that theories should submit to the senses. While Plato was suspicious of the senses deceive us, Aristotle believed that theory should submit to the senses, that observation is the foundation for knowledge and for all of our theories, and he engages in a number of experiments and really moves science ahead quite a bit. There's, I believe, a psychologist named Daniel N. Robinson who said, imagine that aliens had visited the Earth, 2,300 years ago and thought, you know what? Humans are not moving along quick enough. Hey, Aristotle, go down, pretend to be a human and move them along and give them some ideas about science that will advance their civilization. And that gives you a sense of how groundbreaking Aristotle's natural philosophy was. Aristotle is also famous for laying out 4 causes in his metaphysics. There are material causes, something's made out of. So imagine I had a wooden chair. The wood is the material cause. The formal cause is kind of the design of the thing. So imagine, the design of the chair that is in the mind of the maker who creates the thing. That's the formal cause. The efficient cause would be the chair maker. The person who made the chair is the one who literally brought it into being. The final cause refers to the purpose of the chair, which in this situation is for sitting. If there was no idea of a chair, if there was no purpose for a chair, then there would not be a chair. The chair maker would not have made one, right? Material, formal, efficient, and final causes. We live in a world in which, in the modern world, we don't believe in formal causes and final causes anymore. We only have material and efficient causes, at least in the way that our scientists think, and that's a real shame. So that was a lot of information. I want to kind of take some of the major ideas of Plato and Aristotle and place them here so we get a sense of how different these two philosophies are. Plato believed that truth is within, the senses deceive. He believed that when I learn, I'm remembering something that my soul knew, before I was even born, right? That I'm not going to look out into the world because the senses will deceive me. There's a sense in which we are pursuing a kind of inner truth. Whereas Aristotle believed that truth is without. The senses are the foundation of knowledge. He's the father of empiricism. Plato asserted that the material universe has a beginning, and it's a lesser copy of the spiritual. Whereas Aristotle asserts that the material universe is eternal and is worthy of exploration. Plato views study of the material world as kind of a means to an end, and that end is understanding the deeper spiritual world. Whereas Aristotle believes, no, the physical world can be appreciated and explored for what it is inherently. Plato believes that God crafted the world purposefully, right? He's the demiurge. Whereas Aristotle asserts that God is not aware of the world and does not care for it, right? Because he's the unmoved mover. He's not moved by it. Plato asserts that the soul is eternal and can exist without the body. If my body is dead, my soul lives on. Whereas Aristotle asserted that the soul is the form of the body and cannot exist without it. Plato asserts that change is decay, right? I mean, the fact that we live in a world in which things are changing means that they're not perfect, because perfect things do not change. And as a matter of fact, look at everything that is entropy. Everything is tunneling towards decay, whereas Aristotle says, no, change is also growth and evolution. I mean, think of his political philosophy. His ideal city is a place where everyone is striving to improve and to be better and better. And Plato rejects individualism. Plato is kind of the collectivist, right? Think of Socrates, who refuses to demand his individual rights for the sake of the common good. Think of Plato's Republic, in which you're sorted into various classes, in which there's no private property, in which there's not even private families anymore for the sake of a common good. He's trying to reject individualism, whereas Aristotle embraces individualism. Aristotle believes that a healthy society is a society in which diversity can abound, a society full of individuals who are crafting individual friendships with each other and striving towards the good together. And finally, Plato was very critical of Athens, right? He's upset with Athens, and he believed that Sparta was a more virtuous society, a place where people were less individual-centered, less selfish and self-centered, and had a higher goal for the common good. Whereas Aristotle favored urban Athens, right? He believed that Athenian society is a society full of people who are more free, full of people who have the ability to pursue virtue in a way that perhaps Spartans cannot. Now, this is a mouthful, but I want us to look at this chart and think a little bit. Which philosophy do you think is more compatible with Christianity? Right? And that's a question that Christians have asked over the centuries. Obviously, neither is perfectly compatible. Christians have appreciated certain things about Platonism, namely the idea that there is a deeper reality, a spiritual world, that is more important than what is right before me. This idea of God as a purposeful crafter, one who is good, who crafts a good world, a rational world. Christians agree with Plato that the soul does not die when the body is destroyed. However, there are things about Aristotelian philosophy that are enticing. Platonism can err on the side of discounting the value of the physical world. But think about the fact that Christ became man, became flesh, right? Think about the fact that there is a bodily resurrection. Think about the fact that God created this world and called it good. Think also of the fact that Aristotelian individualism seems to overlap somewhat with certain principles in Scripture. The idea that I must make an individual decision to follow Jesus. This idea of virtue and friendship that we feel maybe, I mean, if there was someone who exemplified a virtuous friendship and pursuing the good of another, what better example than Christ? So these ideas are going to kind of move back and forth over the course of history, but really the clincher is going to be, how do we come to understand salvation? Are we going to understand salvation in Platonic or Aristotelian terms? And I haven't covered that quite yet, but we'll cover it in the future. All right, I hope that you were able to follow along decently well. Thank you so much for sticking through this lecture, and I'm so excited to continue exploring Christian history with you all.